Okay, so we are sort of coming into the home stretch on this quarter, believe it or not. We only have a few weeks left. And so in this module this week, we are going to be talking about Chapter 14, Chapter 15, and Chapter 16. So I don't want you to get freaked out by the amount of material in this because we are not going to be spending very much time in any one chapter. There's a ton of information in Chapter 14, for example, in the book on cranial nerves. We are hardly going to cover any of it. In fact, this is the world's shortest PowerPoint. So really all I want you to know about the cranial nerves is their basic function, basic, how they differ from spinal nerves, and each one, the name, and their basic function. Easy, right? So the only part of the book in Chapter 14 that you need to read is Table 14.1. There's a lot of really awesome information about cranial nerves and their function and dysfunction, but we can't cover everything in the amount of time that we have, and so Table 14.1 on page 330 is the only information that you will need to know for the test. And so it's basically the individual cranial nerves and their basic function. For example, cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve. Its function is smell, and it connects to the inferior frontal lobe. So that's all you have to know. There's a list of the 12 of them. There in the module there is a link to the cranial nerve quizzer, which is really a nice way to study for the exam. So just in general, cranial nerves, we'll go back here, they exchange information between the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. They're sort of the you can almost think of them as the peripheral nervous system for the head, and the rest of the peripheral nervous system is for the body. They have sensory, motor, and autonomic functions for the head. So they differ from spinal nerves in specialization. So spinal nerves are specialized. They're motor nerves, they're sensory nerves, or they're autonomic nerves. Cranial nerves can do several of those functions. So really that's the main difference between cranial nerves and spinal nerves. So their 4 functions are supplying motor innervation to the muscles of the face, eyes, tongue, jaw, and 2 of the neck muscles. So that's why when I say they're sort of like the peripheral nervous system for the head and face, they supply the functions that the lower motor neurons do to the body, so that motor innervation. They also transmit the somatosensory information from the skin and muscles of the face and the temporomandibular joint. So they're the somatosensory system of the head. Some of them transmit what we call special senses, special sensory information related to visual, auditory, vestibular, gustatory, which is taste, olfactory, which is smell, and visceral sensations. A lot of the visceral sensations are carried on the vagus nerve, and that's a big part of the autonomic nervous system. Its major autonomic function is it provides parasympathetic regulation of pupil size, lens curvature, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, and digestion. And a lot of that, again, is cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. So there's a little diagram that's in the module as well. It just shows where they come off the brainstem. One of the cranial nerve quizzers, there's a link to in the module, lets you pick, know anatomically which one is which on the cranial nerves, and you will not need to know that for the exam. If you want to know it just for your own personal edification, that is awesome, but you will not need to know that. So we'll just look at the module really quick. Has that same, the 4 functions, has that same diagram, and then it has some of those study tools with a chart and the 2 quizzers. Quizzer number 2 is the one that is a good one to study for the exam. So it has the different nerves listed on the side where you can select. It tells you a cranial nerve function. And so we say eyelid and eyeball movement. Well, the oculomotor nerve, that sounds like a good one. And you check your answer and it says, yes, you got it right. And so that is just kind of one of those little quizzers. It's easy. It makes it easy to select that. And chewing, well, it's the trigeminal nerve. And you check your answer, and yes, you got it right. It says goofy things. So, and then hearing, you go, well, I think that's the vestibular cochlear nerve. Yes, it's the vestibular cochlear nerve. So it lets you go through, and it presents them randomly, and you can go through it as many times as you want. And by now, you know how I write exams, and this, when you have a list of things and a brief list of things and a brief list of things that they do, hey, that sounds like a good matching question. So that's the type of question that you can expect to see on the exam related to cranial nerves and nothing else. So you do not need to read anything else in the whole rest of the chapter. Okay, so we're going to move on to the brainstem. And the brainstem, again, there's a lot of great information in the book, which we will not be going over. There's a lot of sort of detailed anatomical stuff, and while it is interesting, and I have some of the pictures in the PowerPoint and in the module, I'm not going to quiz you in detail on the individual nuclei or the individual vertical tracts or anything like that. We're going to talk a little bit about the neurotransmitters that are released by the brainstem. And it's it has a lot of different functions in the body, so we're going to talk about the individual areas and their functions, and a few dysfunctions of the brainstem, and that's where we're going to leave it. When you look at the module objectives for the brainstem, there aren't very many of them, so we're going to be pretty simple about it. So there are the vertical tracts that are running up the spinal cord. All of them run through the brainstem. The brainstem is like an aqueduct that is transmitting all that information. So we get sensory, autonomic, and motor vertical tracts traveling through the brainstem. Some of the tracts continue. Some of them cross over in the brainstem, like they cross over in the medulla, like the sensory tracts, and then go on to the brain. The brainstem acts as a conduit from the spinal cord to the brain. Okay, so there's a little picture here of the vertical tracts. It only has the sensory and motor tracts, just to simplify. It doesn't have the autonomic tracts, and so the sensory tracts are the blue and green ones. The motor tracts are the red ones. So it just shows you how some of them pass through, some of them synapse, like when you look at the dorsal column medial lemniscus, it synapses in the brainstem and it passes on from there. Some of them just pass right through. Some of the motor tracts stop in the brainstem, some of them just pass right through. So you don't need to know specifically which ones. This is just an example of how the brainstem acts as a conduit. Okay? So, let me head over to the module. And in the module, it talks a little bit about the anatomy, but you do not need to know that in detail. All of the cranial nerves come off the brainstem. There's a video that has a nice little bit of anatomy. Again, you don't need to know all that detail. There's a totally stupid video. I'll warn you, it's stupid. Just if you're just in the mood for something silly and you got a minute to kill, it's kind of funny and it sticks in your head. Brainstem. Okay. So we're going to start talking about some of the specific structures of the brainstem, and I'm going to do that in the next lecture section.